Jake Miller didn't even bother lowering his voice. He laughed and called the old man a liability, a retired SWAT officer with a bad knee, too slow for modern work. He said the German Shepherd was unstable, dangerous, and useless. To Jake, Frank Donovan and his dog were relics from another era, mistakes the system hadn't erased yet. But when the blizzard came without warning, when alarms failed and panic spread through the dark, Jake's confidence collapsed. And in the middle of the storm, with lives on the line and nowhere left to turn, he realized the truth he had refused to see. The only ones who truly knew what to do were the man he underestimated, and the dog he nearly sent away. Winter arrived without ceremony, settling over the Montana foothills like a verdict that had already been decided. Frank Donovan woke before dawn, the way he always did, not because he wanted to, but because his body no longer understood the concept of rest. The cold had seeped into the bones of the old log cabin sometime during the night, crawling through the warped floorboards and cracked window seals until it lodged itself deep inside his left knee. The knee throbbed with a dull, familiar pain, an old souvenir from a forced entry gone wrong 12 years ago. He sat on the edge of his bed for a full minute before standing, jaw clenched, breathing slow, letting the ache settle into something manageable. Pain was easier when you didn't fight it. He had learned that a long time ago. Frank was 63, though his reflection in the small, fogged bathroom mirror often made him look older. His face was cut hard, angular in a way that never softened with age. A crooked nose, broken twice, cast a shadow over a mouth that rarely smiled. His beard had gone mostly gray, thick and coarse, trimmed short out of habit rather than vanity. The hair on his head was thinning but stubborn, steel-colored and always unruly, no matter how often he ran a hand through it. His eyes were the color of old ice, pale blue and distant, the kind that watched rooms without ever seeming to look at anyone in particular. His right hand shook slightly as he reached for the sink, the tremor subtle but persistent. Nerve damage. The doctors had called it permanent. Frank had called it irrelevant. It only showed up when he was tired or cold, and winter made sure he was always both. He dressed slowly, layering thermal fabric beneath an old dark jacket that still carried the faint outline of a SWAT patch long since removed. The jacket was heavy, worn smooth at the elbows, and smelled faintly of pine smoke and gun oil. It fit him like memory. He paused once, fingers brushing the empty space on his belt where a badge used to sit, then turned away before the thought could take hold. The cabin itself was small and stubborn, much like its owner. Built decades ago at the edge of the forest, it leaned slightly to the west as if bracing itself against the wind. The wood stove crackled in the corner, its heat uneven but dependable. There were no pictures on the walls, no decorations beyond function. Everything inside had a purpose, and anything without one had been discarded long ago. A low sound came from near the door. Not a bark, not a whine, just the quiet shift of weight and breath. Rex lifted his head. The German Shepherd was older now, his muzzle dusted with gray, his once powerful frame leaner, tighter, as if time had carefully shaved away anything unnecessary. He was large, even by the breed standards, with a broad chest and shoulders that still hinted at strength, though the stiffness in his movements betrayed the years. His left ear bore a jagged scar that folded it permanently at the tip, the result of shrapnel from a blast Frank preferred not to remember. One of his back paws dragged just slightly when he walked, not enough to slow him down, but enough to remind anyone paying attention that Rex, like his handler, was no longer what he used to be. His eyes, though, were sharp, dark, watching. Frank met that gaze and nodded once. Rex rose with a grunt, stretching carefully before padding over. The dog's presence filled the cabin in a way no furniture ever could. He smelled of cold air and old fur, of loyalty that had never once asked for permission. "You ready?" Frank muttered. Rex's tail thumped once against the floor. That was all the answer he ever gave. Outside, the world was gray and unwelcoming. Snow lay thick against the tree line, piled high enough to swallow fence posts and half buried the narrow path that led down toward town. The sky hung low, heavy with the promise of more. Frank stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking beneath his weight, and let the cold bite into his lungs. He welcomed it. The cold was honest. It didn't pretend to be anything else. They walked slowly, man and dog moving in practiced silence. Frank favored his left leg, and Rex matched the pace without being told. They'd been doing that for years now, adjusting to each other without words, without fuss. Once they had moved fast, sharp, like a single weapon. Now they moved like survivors. The town of Alder Creek sat a mile down the road, small and unremarkable, the kind of place people pass through without remembering. A handful of houses, a gas station, a diner that closed too early, and a security depot on the outskirts that hired men half Frank's age to stand around and feel important. Frank worked nights there when the weather allowed, doing what they called supplemental coverage. He learned quickly that the job was less about protection and more about appearances. As they neared the edge of town, a pickup truck passed, its tires hissing over packed snow. The driver glanced at Frank, then away just as quickly. No wave, no nod. Frank didn't expect one. In Alder Creek, Frank Donovan was a rumor at best, an old SWAT cop who'd been retired early, a man who lived too close to the woods and kept a dangerous dog. People talked quietly, if they talked at all. They said he was slow, that his hands shook, that the dog couldn't be trusted. They never said it to his face. Frank stopped near the gas station, resting a hand on Rex's back. The dog stood alert, ears angled forward, watching the empty road like it might suddenly betray them. Frank followed his gaze, scanning out of habit. Nothing moved, nothing ever did. He exhaled slowly. There'd been a time when this silence would have made him uneasy, back when quiet meant something was wrong. Now, it just meant he'd been forgotten. Frank turned back toward the cabin, boots crunching against the snow, Rex falling in beside him. Behind them, Alder Creek continued on as if they'd never passed through at all. No one called out. No one needed them. And as the winter pressed in closer, heavier and colder with every passing day, the world seemed perfectly content to leave them where they were, two relics standing at the edge of everything, waiting for a reason to matter again. Frank Donovan worked nights now, the kind of work that paid just enough to keep the lights on and the cabin warm. The security company called it contract patrol, which sounded official until you saw the job for what it was. Walking frozen perimeters, checking locks that rarely failed, and standing in the cold so others didn't have to. The depot sat on the outskirts of Alder Creek, a squat concrete building with floodlights that hummed and flickered like tired sentries. Frank arrived early, as he always did, boots crunching across packed snow, Rex at his side, leash loose but unnecessary. The man waiting inside the guard office looked nothing like Frank. Jake Miller was 32, tall and athletic, in a way that suggested a gym membership rather than a lifetime of strain. His jawline was sharp, clean-shaven to the point of shine, and his hair was dark blonde, cut short on the sides with a careful fade that required regular maintenance. His uniform fit perfectly, pressed and crisp, the company logo bright on his chest. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been truly afraid, and mistook that for experience. Jake glanced up from a tablet as Frank entered, his eyes flicking first to the dog. "You're late," he said, though Frank wasn't. "Clock says otherwise," Frank replied calmly. Jake smirked, the corner of his mouth lifting as if the exchange amused him. "We'll see how long you keep up tonight." His gaze dropped to Frank's left leg as Frank shifted his weight. "Perimeter's icy." Frank said nothing. He signed in, clipped his radio to his jacket, and turned to leave. "Keep the dog on a tight leash," Jake added. "We've had complaints." Rex's ears twitched. Frank rested a hand on the dog's neck, fingers sinking into thick fur. "He's trained," Frank said. "So you say." Jake's smile widened, thin and knowing. But things change. People get slow. Dogs, too. Outside, the cold bit harder than before. Frank moved along the fence line, flashlight cutting a pale cone through drifting snow. He didn't rush. Rushing led to mistakes. Rex padded beside him, head low, scenting the air. They worked in silence, the kind that allowed thought to wander where it shouldn't. Jake followed at a distance, boots scuffing louder than necessary. "You ever think about retirement?" he called out. Frank stopped, turning just enough to meet Jake's eyes. "I thought I was retired." Jake laughed. "Right, forced out. That's what they call it when the body gives up before the mind does." Frank's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. "You done talking?" "For now," Jake said, lifting his hands. "Just trying to help." They continued the patrol. Jake talked about academy drills, about protocols, about how modern security was about visibility and deterrence, not old instincts and gut feelings. Frank listened without responding, cataloging the younger man's blind spots, the way he used to catalog rooms, exits ignored, angles underestimated, silence misread. Near the far edge of the property, Rex stopped. His body stiffened, tail low, nose lifted. Frank halted instantly. "What is it?" Jake asked, irritation creeping into his voice. Rex growled, low and steady. "Control your dog," Jake snapped. "There's nothing out here." Frank scanned the darkness. He saw it then, a faint movement near the tree line. Not a person, not an animal, just the suggestion of something out of place. He adjusted his light, revealing an empty stretch of snow and an old service road beyond it. "Probably wind," Jake said, already turning away. Frank lingered a moment longer before following. He said nothing, but the unease stayed with him, settling deep. The shift ended without incident. Jake clapped Frank on the shoulder as they checked out, the gesture patronizing. "You did okay," he said. "For tonight." Frank didn't reply. Instead of heading straight home, Frank took the long way, cutting through the forest toward a cluster of abandoned cabins half buried by snow. Rex led without being told, choosing the path with care. The cabin they stopped at was little more than a shell, its roof sagging, windows boarded with mismatched planks. Smoke curled faintly from a makeshift chimney. Frank knocked twice, then once. The door opened to reveal Thomas Reed, a man in his late 50s with a beard gone wild and eyes that had seen too much. Reed was tall but hollowed out, his frame gaunt beneath layers of donated coats. His hair was iron gray, pulled back into a short tie that did nothing to hide the scars along his scalp. His hands shook worse than Frank's, a constant tremor born from a roadside blast in Kandahar that had killed the rest of his convoy. "You're late," Reed said, though there was no heat in it. "Ran long," Frank replied. He set a paper bag on the small table inside. "Brought soup and batteries." Reed nodded, closing the door against the cold. "Dog looks older." "So do you." Reed smiled faintly. Rex stepped forward, pressing his head into Reed's thigh. Reed rested a hand on the dog, his fingers rough and gentle all at once. "Good to see you, boy." They sat in silence while Reed ate, the only sound the wind scraping against the cabin walls. Frank checked the stove, adjusted the vent, and replaced a cracked blanket with a thicker one. "You don't have to keep doing this," Reed said finally. Frank shrugged. "Someone should." Reed looked at him, really looked, eyes narrowing. "They treat you like they treat me now?" Frank didn't answer right away. He watched Rex curl near the door, ever vigilant. "They don't see," he said at last. Reed nodded. "No, they never do." Frank stood, pulling his jacket tighter. "Storm's coming. I'll check on you after." Reed hesitated, then spoke. "Be careful with that kid you work for. Men who've never bled tend to push until someone else does." Frank paused at the door, considering. "I know." Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the promise of worse. Frank and Rex moved back toward the cabin, the path already filling with fresh snow. Behind them, the lights of Alder Creek glowed dim and distant, unaware of the quiet fractures forming just beneath the surface. The blizzard arrived faster than the forecast promised, rolling down from the mountains like a living thing, intent on swallowing whatever stood in its path. By the time Frank Donovan stepped out onto his porch, the wind had sharpened into a howl that rattled the cabin walls and erased the tree line beyond 50 yards. Snow fell sideways, thick and relentless, turning the world into a white tunnel with no depth and no mercy. Rex was already alert, standing rigid at the edge of the porch, head angled into the wind. His ears flicked back and forth, catching sounds the storm tried to bury. Frank watched him closely, reading the tension in the dog's posture the way he once read men before a door came down. This wasn't weather anxiety. This was recognition. Frank checked his radio. Static hissed, then cleared just enough for a voice to cut through. "All units, report to depot. We've got an alert." Jake Miller's voice followed, sharp and energized. "Possible gas leak at the old fuel storage site off County Road 9. Employee unresponsive. Storm or not, we move now." Frank didn't answer immediately. He looked at Rex, then at the wall of white beyond the porch. The fuel site sat 3 miles out, exposed and elevated, a bad place to be in clear weather and a worse one in a storm. "Copy," Frank said finally. At the depot, floodlights struggled against the snow, their beams dissolving into glowing fog. Jake stood near the trucks, posture straight, chin high, his jacket immaculate despite the wind. He looked almost pleased. Crisis gave him something to command. "You're with Perimeter," Jake said as soon as Frank approached. "I'll take point with the response team." Frank frowned. "Gas leaks aren't Perimeter problems." Jake's eyes hardened. "This isn't a debate. You're too slow for extraction in this weather." Rex growled softly. Jake shot the dog a warning look. "And that thing stays out of my way." Frank stepped closer, close enough that Jake could see the lines carved deep into his face. "You don't smell gas," Frank said. "You don't rush into a confined site during a pressure shift." Jake laughed once, sharp and dismissive. "This isn't your old SWAT playground. We follow procedure." Procedure, Frank thought, doesn't breathe. People do. Sirens wailed as the trucks pulled out, taillights disappearing into the storm. Frank stood for a moment, snow crusting on his shoulders, radio crackling with overlapping chatter. Rex paced in a tight circle, nails clicking against ice, eyes fixed on the road. "Easy," Frank murmured, though his own pulse had begun to quicken. He moved to the edge of the lot, scanning the wind, the snow, the dark shapes shifting at the limits of vision. The storm carried a faint acrid scent that didn't belong to pine or diesel. Rex caught it too. His hackles rose. "Frank," came Jake's voice again, strained now. "We're on site. Wind's worse than expected. Visibility's trash." Frank keyed his radio. "Pull back, secure and ventilate. Don't enter." Silence followed. Then, "Negative. We've got a man down inside the storage shed." "I'm going in." Rex barked once, sharp and urgent. Frank didn't hesitate. He moved. He loaded Rex into the truck, hands steady despite the tremor creeping into his fingers. The drive was a blur of white and noise, the road nearly invisible beneath drifting snow. Frank drove by memory and instinct, counting curves, reading the way the wind scoured the surface. Rex braced himself, muscles coiled, eyes forward. They arrived to chaos. One truck idled at a bad angle, door hanging open. The storage site loomed ahead, a cluster of rusted tanks and a low shed half buried in snow. Wind screamed through the metal structures, carrying the unmistakable bite of gas. Frank jumped out, cold slicing into him like glass. He spotted movement near the shed. Jake and 2 men stood arguing, their words torn apart by the storm. "You can't be here," Jake shouted when he saw Frank. "I ordered you to Perimeter." "You ordered wrong," Frank said. He crouched, touching the snow, then the air. "Pressure's dropping. Gas is pooling." Jake shook his head. "You're overthinking it." A sound cut through them then, thin and wrong. A hiss growing louder. Rex lunged forward, straining against the leash, eyes locked on the shed. Frank followed his gaze and saw it, a shimmer in the air near the base of one tank, barely visible against the storm. "Everyone back," Frank barked. Jake stepped forward instead. "Stand down." The hiss became a roar. Frank acted without thinking. He grabbed Jake by the collar and shoved him hard into the snow, throwing his own weight behind the motion. Jake went down, shouting in fury. At the same instant, Frank cut Rex loose. "Go," he said. Rex charged into the storm, disappearing in a blur of fur and snow. A heartbeat later, the world erupted. The explosion was not the fireball movies promised. It was a concussive force, a violent punch of pressure that flattened sound and knocked men off their feet. Frank felt himself lifted, slammed back into the truck. Heat flashed, then vanished, replaced by a ringing silence. When the noise returned, it came as screams and alarms. Frank forced himself up, lungs burning, vision swimming. The shed was gone, replaced by twisted debris and flame licking at the snow. He scanned wildly. "Rex!" he shouted, movement near the wreckage. Rex emerged, dragging a limp figure by the collar of his jacket, the man coughing violently, alive. One of Rex's hind legs bled where shrapnel had torn flesh, but the dog did not slow. Frank reached them, dropping to his knees, pulling the injured man free. Jake stumbled toward them, face pale beneath the frost. "You," Jake began, then stopped, staring at the crater where he had been standing seconds earlier. Sirens grew louder in the distance. Frank looked at Rex, at the blood staining the snow, at the devastation around them. The storm raged on, indifferent, but something fundamental had shifted beneath it. The mistakes had been made. The line had been crossed. And there would be no pretending otherwise when morning came. Morning came pale and bruised, the storm retreating just enough to reveal what it had broken. Frank Donovan stood at the edge of the fuel site, boots planted in churned snow that had turned gray with ash and blood. The air still smelled sharp, metallic, the kind of scent that clung to clothes and refused to be forgotten. Emergency crews moved with methodical precision around the wreckage, their radios murmuring, their faces set in practiced calm. The explosion had been contained, they said. Miraculously, no fatalities. That word, miraculously, hung in the cold like a lie that wanted to be believed. Rex lay on a blanket near the ambulance, chest rising and falling in slow, stubborn rhythm. The German shepherd's hind leg was wrapped in gauze darkened by seeped blood, a temporary splint taped tight. His ears twitched whenever Frank shifted, eyes opening just enough to confirm his handler's presence before closing again. Pain hadn't dulled his awareness. It never had. Frank crouched beside him, gloved hand resting between Rex's shoulders. "You did good," he murmured. The words were not praise, they were acknowledgement. "Mr. Donovan," a voice called. Frank straightened slowly. The man approaching wore a state safety jacket, reflective stripes catching the weak morning light. He was in his late 40s, thick around the middle, with a neatly trimmed mustache and eyes that missed very little. His name patch read, Harris. He held a clipboard like a shield. "I'm Mark Harris," the man said, "State Safety Inspector. I need to ask you some questions." Frank nodded once. "I figured." They walked a short distance away, boots crunching. Harris glanced back at Rex. "Dog okay?" "He will be." Harris hesitated, then continued. "We've got conflicting reports. Your supervisor says you violated direct orders." Frank said nothing. Harris cleared his throat. "He claims you interfered with an active response, physically restrained him, and released an animal into a hazardous zone." "That animal pulled a man out alive," Frank replied evenly. Harris raised a hand. "I'm not disputing the outcome. I'm here to understand the decision-making." Frank looked past him toward the crater where the shed had stood. Decision-making didn't start last night. It started when he ignored the signs. "Signs," Harris repeated. "Which were?" Pressure shift, gas pooling low, wind direction, Frank said, and a K9 alert. Harris scribbled something down. Your supervisor claims the dog was agitated and uncontrollable. Frank's eyes hardened. He's trained to detect things humans miss. Harris studied Frank for a moment, then nodded slowly. I'll include that. A commotion rose near the command truck. Jake Miller stood there, jacket unzipped, hair plastered by meltwater, his face a map of sleepless shock and simmering anger. He was arguing with a county official, words sharp, gestures wide. When he noticed Frank watching, he broke away and marched over. You had no authority, Jake said, stopping inches from Frank. Up close, the younger man looked different, eyes rimmed red, confidence cracked around the edges. You undermined command. You were about to get people killed, Frank said. Jake's jaw worked. You tackled me in front of my team. Frank shrugged. You were standing in the kill zone. Harris stepped between them. Gentlemen, let's keep this professional. Jake laughed brittle. Professional? He went rogue. Frank didn't respond. He had learned long ago that arguments were for people who needed to convince themselves. By noon, the site was cleared and cordoned. Frank was told to wait. He sat on the tailgate of his truck, watching snowmelt drip in slow, steady lines. Rex was loaded gently into the back, wrapped and warm, eyes following every movement. Frank's phone buzzed once. A message from the security company. Report to office at 1600. The office smelled of disinfectant and cheap coffee. Jake stood by the window when Frank entered, posture stiff, shoulders squared like armor. A third man sat behind the desk, older, heavier, his suit strained at the buttons. His hair was silver and carefully parted, his skin ruddy from years indoors. His nameplate read, David Caldwell, Regional Director. Sit, Caldwell said. Frank remained standing. I'm fine, Caldwell sighed. Mr. Donovan, last night was expensive. Property damage, liability exposure. People lived, Frank said. Caldwell pinched the bridge of his nose. That's not the point. Jake turned. He disobeyed a lawful order. Frank met his gaze. You gave a bad one. Caldwell's eyes snapped up. Enough. Frank, your actions forced this company into a defensive position. Regardless of outcome, protocol exists for a reason. Frank looked around the room, at the polished surfaces, the framed mission statements. Protocols don't stop explosions, he said quietly. People do. Jake scoffed. And your way is to ignore command? My way is to read the environment, Frank replied, and listen when something tells you you're wrong. Caldwell leaned back, fingers steepled. Your supervisor recommends termination. The word landed without drama. Frank felt it pass through him like cold air through a crack. He had expected it. Jake watched him closely, waiting for a reaction. There was none. I'm placing you on immediate suspension pending review, Caldwell continued. Your dog is barred from company property. Frank's hand tightened at his side. He saved a life, Caldwell shrugged. He's a liability. Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. Frank nodded once. We're done here. As he turned to leave, Jake spoke, his voice lower now. You embarrassed me. Frank paused, glancing back. You embarrassed yourself. Outside, the sky had cleared to a brittle blue. Frank loaded Rex carefully, adjusting the blanket, checking the bandage. The dog's tail thumped weakly once. Home, Frank said. They drove in silence, the road winding back toward the forest. The cabin came into view, smoke rising thin and steady. Frank helped Rex inside, settled him near the stove, and knelt to tend the wound again. His hands shook, more from anger than cold. A knock came at the door. Frank opened it to find Thomas Reed standing there, hunched against the chill, eyes sharp beneath his battered cap. Heard about the explosion, Reed said. Figured it was you. Frank snorted. That obvious? Reed stepped inside, glancing at Rex. Dog's a hero. So they say. Reed studied Frank's face. "They coming after you?" Frank didn't answer directly. "They already did." Reed nodded, unsurprised. "Happens when you make cowards look small." They stood in companionable silence, the stove popping softly. Outside, the forest creaked as the last of the storm moved on. Frank looked down at Rex, at the steady rise of his chest. The orders had been clear. The consequences were now unavoidable. And still, he would make the same choice again, because some lines were worth crossing. The fire didn't die when the storm passed. It smoldered, patient and treacherous, buried beneath twisted metal and frozen foam, waiting for oxygen and one careless step. Frank Donovan felt it before anyone said a word. He felt it in the way the air shifted near the wreckage, in the subtle pressure behind his eyes, in the way Rex, despite the pain, tried to rise whenever the wind changed direction. They were supposed to be done, the site cleared, the risk contained. That was the official line. Frank sat in his truck near the tree line, engine idling, Rex lying on his side in the back, leg bound tight. Snow creaked as it settled. Radios murmured with routine updates. It would have been easy to believe the danger had passed. It hadn't. Frank stepped out, scanning the tank silhouetted against the pale sky. Frost steamed where heat lingered below the surface. He knelt, pressed a gloved hand to the ground. Warm, too warm. "Control, this is Donovan," he said into the radio. "You've got residual heat pockets near Tank 3. Winds shifting east." Static. Then Jake Miller's voice cut in, sharp and defensive. "We've got it monitored." Frank closed his eyes for half a second. The old memory surfaced uninvited. Another perimeter, another command voice insisting everything was under control while the ground ticked like a bomb. Rex growled, low and insistent. Frank turned. The dog had dragged himself upright, weight off the injured leg, eyes fixed on the tanks. His chest rumbled with warning. "I know," Frank said softly. A county firefighter jogged past, helmet under his arm. He was young, freckles dusted across wind-burned cheeks, breath coming hard in the cold. "Sir, you shouldn't be here," he said, trying to sound authoritative and failing. "They said it's stable." Frank pointed. "That vapor line isn't venting. If the wind gusts, you'll get ignition." The firefighter hesitated, eyes following Frank's finger. "Command didn't mention." The gust came without warning. A sharp blast that whistled through the metal skeleton of the site. The hiss returned, louder now, angry. "Back!" Frank shouted, too late. Flame crawled along the vapor trail, fast and low, a living thing racing toward the tank cluster. Panic rippled through the responders. Someone yelled, boots slipped, radios screamed. Frank moved. He sprinted toward the command truck, pain detonating in his knee with every step. He shoved past two men frozen by indecision and grabbed the emergency cutoff lever, bolted to the frame. The lever was stiff, half frozen, designed for calm hands and clear minds. Frank yanked. It didn't budge. Behind him, someone screamed that the fire was spreading. Frank braced his shoulder, ignored the tearing sensation in his leg, and pulled again. The lever dropped with a metallic clack. Pumps whined, then died. The hiss faltered. Rex barked, one sharp command bark, and bolted from the truck bed. "Rex!" Frank shouted. The German shepherd ran straight into smoke, limping but relentless, drawn by a sound only he seemed to hear. Frank followed, lungs burning, vision blurring at the edges. Through the haze, he saw a figure down near the tank's base, a responder knocked off his feet, helmet gone, leg trapped beneath debris. Rex reached him first, teeth closing on the man's jacket collar. He pulled, muscles screaming, back legs slipping in slush. The man coughed, choking on smoke, fingers scrabbling uselessly at the ground. Frank dropped beside them, heaved the debris free, and hauled the man up. Fire licked closer, heat biting at exposed skin. Rex staggered, a sharp yelp tearing from his throat as his injured leg buckled. Frank scooped the dog up with the man's help, every ounce of strength dragged from somewhere old and buried. They stumbled away as a secondary flare erupted behind them, a roar of heat that flattened the snow into steam. They collapsed near the engines, coughing, shaking, alive. Sirens wailed anew. Fire crews surged forward, finally coordinated, finally listening. Foam sprayed, orders snapped. The blaze was smothered before it could find another breath. Frank sat on the frozen ground, arms wrapped around Rex's shoulders. The dog trembled, pain cutting through shock, but his eyes stayed locked on Frank's face. "You did it," Frank whispered, forehead resting against coarse fur. "You did good." Jake Miller approached slowly, helmet under his arm now, his face stripped of bluster. Soot streaked his jaw. His hands shook as he looked at the scorched ground where he'd nearly stood again. "I didn't see it," Jake said, voice low. "Any of it." Frank didn't gloat. He didn't lecture. He just nodded. Most people don't, until it's too late. Jake swallowed. He looked at Rex, at the blood staining the bandage darker now. The dog saved him. "Yes," Frank said. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the hiss of cooling metal and the distant wind. Jake straightened, something rigid and formal settling over him. "I'll put it in my report," he said. "All of it." Frank met his eyes. "Do what you think is right." Jake hesitated, then extended a hand. It shook when Frank took it. Paramedics arrived, moving with urgency. Rex was lifted carefully onto a stretcher, his low whine cutting through Frank like a blade. Frank walked alongside, refusing help, refusing to let go. As they loaded Rex into the ambulance, Frank caught his reflection in the metal door, face smeared with soot, eyes bright with something fierce and unbroken. The instincts he'd tried to bury had risen without permission, had taken over when protocols failed and fear took hold. The ambulance doors closed. Frank stood alone in the snow, chest heaving, the smell of smoke clinging to him. The storm had passed, the damage was done, and the truth, raw and undeniable, was finally out in the open. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and melted snow, a clean sharpness that made Frank Donovan's head throb. He sat in a hard plastic chair outside the treatment room, jacket unzipped, hands clasped loosely between his knees. The tremor in his right hand had grown worse, not from injury, but from the slow crash that followed adrenaline. He stared at the scuffed floor tiles and waited. Behind the closed door, Rex whimpered once, then went quiet. A veterinarian stepped out a moment later. She was in her early 40s, average height, brown hair pulled into a tight braid that brushed the collar of her scrubs. Her face was calm, practiced, but her eyes held the fatigue of someone who worked emergencies in a small town that saw more than it should. A faint scar cut through her left eyebrow, old and pale. "He's stable," she said. Frank exhaled, a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Will he walk?" "Eventually," she replied. "He tore muscle, aggravated the previous injury. He'll limp. Probably always." She paused. "But he's alive because he's stubborn, and because you didn't let him quit." Frank nodded once. That was enough. He was still sitting there when the men arrived. They didn't wear uniforms. That was the first thing Frank noticed. One was tall and lean, early 50s, with silver hair cut short and eyes that missed nothing. The other was broader, heavier through the shoulders, his beard trimmed close, his posture military even in a civilian coat. Both carried themselves with quiet authority. "Frank Donovan?" the taller one asked. Frank stood slowly. "That's me." "I'm Deputy Marshal Alan Price," the man said, flashing a badge too quickly for anyone else to catch. "This is Captain Robert Hayes, County Emergency Oversight." Hayes nodded. "We need to talk." They moved to a small consultation room. Frank didn't bother sitting. Price opened a folder, pages thick and clipped. "We've reviewed the site footage, body cams, radio logs, thermal scans." He looked up. "Your supervisor's report doesn't align with the data." Frank said nothing. Hayes leaned against the counter. "He claimed you interfered repeatedly and escalated risk." Frank's eyes stayed level. He escalated it by ignoring reality. Price flipped a page. According to wind telemetry, gas concentrations reached ignition threshold twice. Both times you initiated actions that prevented further casualties. And the dog, Hayes added, glancing toward the door, pulled 2 responders clear. Frank's jaw tightened. He did his job. Price closed the folder. Mr. Donovan, this incident is no longer an internal matter. Frank finally spoke. So what happens now? Hayes met his gaze. Now the truth gets written down. The meeting with the company happened that afternoon. The same office, the same polished desk. David Caldwell sat rigid, tie loosened, confidence leaking from the edges. Jake Miller stood beside him, pale, eyes sunken, his usual sharpness dulled. A third chair was occupied by Alan Price. Caldwell forced a smile. This is highly irregular. Price didn't return it. So was ignoring gas telemetry. Caldwell swallowed. We acted on available information. You ignored it, Price corrected. He slid a tablet across the desk. Here's the footage. Here's the timestamp where your supervisor overrides a pullback order. Here's where Donovan initiates emergency shutdown. And here, he tapped again, is the dog extracting a downed responder while your command structure collapses. Jake's face flushed. He stared at the screen, jaw tight. I didn't know, he said quietly. Price looked at him. You didn't listen. Silence filled the room. Caldwell cleared his throat. Mr. Donovan's actions were unauthorized. Hayes stepped forward. They were necessary. Caldwell's eyes flicked between them. This company can't endorse insubordination. Price's voice dropped, dangerous and calm. This county can't endorse negligence. Caldwell sagged back in his chair. What are you saying? I'm saying, Price replied, that your report is being amended. Your supervisor's judgment is under review, and any attempt to retaliate against Mr. Donovan will be documented. Jake looked up sharply. Retaliate? Price met his eyes. Termination, blacklisting, threats. He paused. All of which have been alleged. Caldwell opened his mouth, then closed it again. Frank stood quietly through it all, a familiar detachment settling over him. He had been in rooms like this before. The uniforms changed, the stakes never did. Afterward, Jake caught up with him in the hallway. I was wrong, Jake said. The words came stiff, rehearsed, but his eyes were raw. I thought command meant control. Frank regarded him for a long moment. Command means responsibility. Jake nodded slowly. They're suspending me, pending retraining. Frank didn't react. That's between you and yourself. Jake hesitated. The dog. He saved my life. Frank's voice softened, just a fraction. He doesn't keep score. The sun was low when Frank returned to the hospital. Rex lay sedated, chest rising and falling, bandages clean and tight. Frank pulled a chair close and rested his hand against the dog's neck, feeling the steady warmth beneath fur and skin. A nurse passed by and paused. She was older than most of the staff, late 50s maybe, tall and narrow, her gray hair cut short and practical. Her face held the quiet competence of someone who had worked through too many nights. She glanced at Rex, then at Frank. That dog's got heart, she said. Frank nodded. So did most of the men I worked with. She smiled faintly. They don't always like people who remind them what courage looks like. Frank watched Rex breathe. I didn't do this for them. No, she agreed. You did it because you couldn't walk away. When Frank left the hospital, night had settled over Alder Creek, clear and bitter. The town lights glowed softer now, less distant. He drove back toward the cabin, the road familiar beneath his tires. At the edge of the forest, he pulled over and shut off the engine. He sat there for a long moment, listening to the quiet, thinking of all the times he had been told to stand down, to look away, to let procedure take precedence over people. The truth had surfaced. It always did, eventually, not loudly, not all at once, but it surfaced, stubborn as a dog dragging a man from fire. Frank started the truck and drove home, knowing that the reckoning was nearly complete. What remained would decide not just his future, but Rex's place in a world that had tried very hard to forget them both. Spring did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, hesitant, melting the edges of winter rather than erasing it. Snow still clung to the shaded ground around Frank Donovan's cabin, but the air no longer cut like a blade. It breathed. Frank noticed the change the way he noticed everything else now, without urgency, without expectation. Rex came home 2 weeks later. The German shepherd moved stiffly, his back leg permanently altered by the injury, but his eyes were the same, sharp, aware, unbroken. Frank helped him down from the truck, steady hands guiding weight that had once leapt without thought. Rex paused at the edge of the porch, nose lifting, scenting familiar wood, smoke, and pine. His tail gave a slow, deliberate wag. "You're home," Frank said. They settled into a new rhythm, slower, more deliberate. Mornings began later, walks were shorter. Frank adapted without complaint, adjusting his pace to match Rex's limp. He had spent a lifetime teaching others to keep up. Now he followed instead. The call came on a quiet afternoon. Frank was splitting wood when his phone buzzed. He stared at it for a moment before answering. "Mr. Donovan," David Caldwell's voice said, stripped of its old confidence, "this is an update." Frank leaned on the axe handle. "Go on." "The county has concluded its review. Your suspension is lifted. Full reinstatement." A pause. "With commendation." Frank said nothing. "And Rex," Caldwell added quickly. "The K-9 board reviewed the footage. They're restoring his service record, officially." Frank closed his eyes. "That's all?" Caldwell hesitated. "There's an opening. Training consultant. You'd oversee—" "No," Frank said, gentle but final. "I understand," Caldwell replied, though he clearly didn't. Frank ended the call and went back to his work. Rex watched from the porch, ears twitching. A week later, Frank drove into Alder Creek for the first time without dread. The town hadn't changed. The people hadn't either, not really. But their eyes did linger longer now. A nod here. A quiet afternoon there. At the security depot, the flag hung at half-staff for reasons unrelated to Frank, but he noticed how the men stood straighter when he passed. Jake Miller waited near the entrance. Jake looked different, thinner, his uniform less pristine, scuffed at the edges. The confidence had been replaced by something sturdier, humility perhaps. "They put me back on probation," Jake said. "Retraining, field supervision only." Frank nodded. "That's how you learn," Jake swallowed. "I wanted to thank you for not letting me die." Frank glanced at Rex. "Thank him." Jake crouched awkwardly, resting a hand near Rex's shoulder. The dog sniffed, then allowed it. "I won't forget," Jake said quietly. Frank believed him. On a clear morning not long after, a county truck pulled into Frank's driveway. Alan Price stepped out, hands in his coat pockets. He surveyed the cabin, the forest, the quiet. "They're recommending you for a civilian commendation," Price said. Frank shrugged. "Belongs to the dog." Price smiled faintly. "I figured you'd say that." He hesitated. "You ever think about staying involved? Teaching?" Frank looked at Rex asleep in the sun, chest rising slow and steady. "I'm still involved," he said. "Just not where people can see." Price nodded. "Fair enough." That afternoon, Frank walked the forest edge with Rex. Snowmelt trickled through shallow channels, the earth dark and alive beneath it. Rex stopped suddenly, head lifting, body tensing out of habit more than need. Frank waited, watching. Nothing came. Rex relaxed and continued on. Frank smiled to himself. They reached the ridge overlooking Alder Creek, the town small and distant, harmless from this height. Frank rested a hand on Rex's back, feeling warmth, feeling life. He had never wanted statues or speeches. He had never needed his name remembered. Honor, he had learned, didn't arrive with applause. It arrived quietly, like a dog coming home. At the end of the day, this story isn't really about explosions or heroics. It's about what happens when experience is ignored, when quiet people are mistaken for broken ones, and when loyalty shows up long after applause disappears. In everyday life, the most important decisions are often made by people no one is watching, in moments that never make headlines. Maybe you've been overlooked at work. Maybe you've been told you're too old, too slow, or no longer needed. Or maybe you've stood by someone who carried scars others couldn't see. Stories like this remind us that value doesn't expire, and integrity doesn't need permission to act. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to know where you saw yourself in it or who it made you think about. Share that in the comments. If stories like this still matter to you, consider subscribing. There are more waiting for you here. Thank you for spending this time with us. Another story is waiting for you. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide your steps. And thank you so much for watching.